Hey folks, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. The situation in Syria has developed to the point where I could provide a bit of an update. The three things I'm going to talk about: the efforts of HTS, the main rebel group, as they transition from a fighting force to a governing force. Second, the legacies of the Assad regime and its practices as they begin to emerge into the light of day. Third, the sort of foreign help that may be available to Syria after this transitionary period, as well as the interference of its neighbors. So to start off, the HTS, the rebel group that led the amalgamation of rebel groups that overthrew the Assad regime, is attempting to actually govern Syria. It's a hopeful thing to see. They're negotiating with other groups in country, as well as making efforts internationally to draw in partners that can help them rebuild Syria, because essentially it's a failed state at this point. Infrastructure's destroyed by 14 years of war. The regime figures like Assad and his family and others that fled plundered the country for decades. It's a huge mess. Furthermore, there are sectarian and ethnic divisions within Syria that present a lot of potential problems, and most of those folks are armed. Whether or not they can actually paper over those divisions to some point until some sort of lasting solution can be found is yet to be seen. At this point, there's some hope, but there's a lot of challenges that lie ahead. Of course, one of the things that the HTS has to deal with, among many, is the horrific legacy of the Assad regime. And this happens often in the wake of failed authoritarian regimes. Their horrific crimes begin to emerge into the light of day. HTS folks and others began to break open prisons and release the political prisoners, including some foreigners. There was one American that was found wandering the streets who'd been captured about a year and a half ago. There are other Americans that were held by the Assad regime for longer. It's hard to tell if they are alive or dead. They have some terrible tales to tell of torture and other sorts of crimes that just defy belief in some cases. Second, the identification of mass graves has begun. It's possible that there are upwards of 100,000 people who've been killed by the regime, probably more like 150,000, that were disappeared, murdered, and then buried in mass graves around the country. And I've got a map up that shows the sites of 3 such places where perhaps as many as thousands and thousands of bodies are buried that were killed over the past 15 years in the Civil War. As noted, this is a common tale when authoritarian regimes collapse. Any kind of resistance, especially when it gets large scale, is met with these kinds of massacres and atrocities. It will take decades of work, hopefully under the guidance of the international authorities from the UN and other countries that specialize in such efforts. Sadly, there's been a lot of experience in Bosnia and elsewhere with these kinds of things. To even partially identify the remains and hopefully give some kind of peace to the family members who are searching for those loved ones. Furthermore, any surviving regime actors that played some role in this will need to be dealt with by whatever judiciary system that Syria comes up with, by international courts, or perhaps summarily executed if found. I would imagine that a lot of those people either got out already or are making plans to do so post-haste. The next thing I want to talk about is the neighborhood and the help that their neighbors could provide and how they can also greatly hinder the efforts of HTS to effectively govern the country. This is a kind of a common theme in the Middle East, is to kick folks when they're down. It's rooted in an endemic mistrust that permeates the region. It relates to something a little bit wonky. Back in the day, in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s and 90s, you might hear someone describe themselves as a realist. And essentially what realism as a theory suggested was that you should, as the leader of a nation, always measure the capabilities and national resources of other countries against your own. If they were gaining, then you were losing. So zero-sum game type of thing. A lot of countries ran their entire foreign policies in this way. This isn't a moral strategy or anything like that. It's just a pure power calculation. If your adversaries are weaker than you, you need to punish them and keep them down and keep them in their place. This has manifested itself in the actions of two of Syria's neighbors, Turkey and Israel. Turkey has taken some efforts to attack a variety of sites in northern and northeastern Syria that may or may not have guerrilla forces that would like to establish a Kurdish homeland in parts of Turkey, parts of Syria, parts of Iraq, and parts of Iran, for that matter. There's been some fighting amongst pro-Turkish and these sort of separatist forces over the last week or so. Israel has acted more boldly, using airstrikes to destroy Syrian weapons depots around the country. They essentially sank what remained of the Syrian Navy, a bunch of coastal patrol boats in port. They also moved to seize a buffer zone in the Golan Heights. And I've got a map up of the Golan Heights that kind of shows where they have made some encroachments. Israel seized much of the Golan Heights in the 1973 Yom Kippur War from Syria. This was kind of a bone of contention, obviously, with Syria for some time. There were some negotiations. Nothing ever happened with it. Israel has moved to expand that seizure of the Golan Heights, including a strategic mountain called Mount Hermon, which I've seen actually when I accidentally wandered into Syria one time. So it's a story for another day. Netanyahu and some other guys actually were airlifted on top of this mountain, and Netanyahu's looking all proud with his bulletproof vest and such, talking about how the might of Israel, and they had taken this mountain. The suggestion is that we're just going to hold on to this for a while until the situation stabilizes. That's really a pipe dream, I would suggest, especially when dealing with Netanyahu and the folks that are around him. They seized some more land. It's not a lot, but they seized some, and they took this mountain. And why did they do that? Because they could. Syria is in disarray. They have the further justification of trying to head off what could be a destabilized Islamist regime, because many of these groups that are involved in the overthrow of Assad have Islamist roots. Finally, what's the international community doing? They are very active. Anthony Blinken, among his many tasks here in the last waning weeks of the Biden administration, has been in contact with some of these groups in Syria. EU representatives, UN representatives, foreign ministers from other countries have been trying to cobble together some sorts of agreements about how HTS and others would govern in Syria, to get some buy-in from them about how to proceed. This is a spot where HTS really needs the help of the international community. Unfortunately, some of these countries are not in the best positions politically to do that. Germany being one, France in particular, which has historical interests in Lebanon and Syria, would seem to be a natural player. However, political turmoil in France and in Germany is kind of keeping that from happening. The United States seem to be pressing full ahead, but again, in several weeks, that's going to be an entirely new administration with completely different priorities. They're trying to pave the way for the recognition of HTS and these other groups as the legitimate ruling force in Syria so that international aid can begin to come in. At the same time, also, they're trying to really nail this stuff down because HTS, after all, was once an al-Qaeda affiliate. This situation remains very volatile. If HTS is to legitimately govern, it has a lot of work to do. Infrastructure-wise, hospitals, electrical generation, water treatment, roads, everything. The place is a real disaster. And if it can assuage the concerns of the international community, bring these things together, maybe there's some hope there. It looks like a lot of people are willing. Syria is not Afghanistan. Syria is a Mediterranean nation. There's a lot of potential there. However, if they can't, it's likely to descend into yet another sectarian war that could last for an indeterminate amount of time. Thanks for stopping by today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Have a great day. Thanks a lot. Bye.